Hello, in this video, I want to talk a little bit more about racial capitalism as it pertains to the worker strike resolution. In the last two videos, we talked a little bit about how policy teams can better respond to this argument when it's read as a negative criticism, because in my opinion, I think that if you're a team that wants to read the CAPK, the best direction is to go down. I think it's to go farther to the left, because I think a lot of the affirmatives that will be answering criticism on this resolution will go farther into saying that they're able to resolve a lot of the arguments that are normatively made on the CAPK. And so I feel like in order for you to have like a really diverse pocket of arguments to really make about the resolution, it's important to think about like how racial capitalism can kind of put a twist on like the over focus on worker strikes and workers unions. And I think that it also makes a lot of really good arguments that kind of like are structurally wrong with the resolution and the idea of recognizing the worker strike, that make it super important to how we're able to think about what type of tactics and kind of like strategy form we're supposed to be doing in the face of like capitalism. And I think that is definitely just a core really good conversation to have. If this is the first time that you're really hearing me talk about racial capitalism on the worker strike resolution, now I would definitely go back and watch the intro to racial capital worker strike video, because I think that it lays a lot of the good background that you'll kind of need in order to talk about the stuff that we'll be doing in this video, which is how do we read racial capitalism as an affirmative argument on the resolution. I think that a lot of teams are definitely worried about this being something that's like too generic, too straight down the middle, or something that like framework teams can easily kind of answer by being able to read things like TVA arguments and like stuff like that. And I definitely want to address a lot of those concerns and talk about why I think this will be such a good argument on this resolution, and then kind of like use it as a way to set up some of the more like final videos that we'll be doing on this particular set of videos. And so the first thing that I want to do is kind of talk about like what I think are like just the best ways to kind of like make this type of affirmative happen, and what are some of the more essential pieces. I think that in general, what's really strong is first having an argument that just problematizes the over focus on the worker strike and the state's relationship to worker strikes and workers unions. I feel like that there's just a long history of the ways in which worker strikes and worker unions have been whitewashed and have only been able to kind of be controlled or ran by the demands of those that kind of experience the worst of capitalism, when they have been put under the focus of being specifically anti-state, anti-government, because it refocuses our energy to how we can better do mutual aid, the ways that we can connect disconnected communities and communities that are made disparate by capitalism and anti-black violence and settler dispossession. And I feel like all these things are like really important to the history of like what the workers kind of relationship is to like capitalism in terms of like resistance. And I think it's an important history to kind of like have to paint against like any type of argument that's being read against you. When I think about the history of kind of just like things like even like for instance the Rainbow Coalition, when you think about the connection between like the Black Panther Party and the kind of like Latinx resistance movement that was happening at the time, and the way in which like white poor workers were also starting to understand the depth of which capitalism was affecting them, and thinking about like the ways in which a workers union could be forced along that coalition, all of which I think point to the ways in which a specific kind of like anti-statist rhetoric that refocuses how like capitalism seeks to disconnect communities and people as like a prior like engagement to how we think about like how the like worker strikes and resistance is able to form itself in the first place. I think it's like a really good primary historical place to kind of like start a lot of these debates. And then I think that you can kind of like move into then it being a question of why even the recognition of these movements at the level of like human rights and things like that repeat the cycles of violence that kind of like separate these communities, proven by the ways in which like various type of tactics via the state, news, and media reporting that have been used against like for instance like black activists and black people that show resistance to the state, and the way in which they're responded to even by like peaceful black activists as being those that are kind of like violating the rule of law, etc., all show the kind of like limitations to like the human rights stuff as a framework. And I think starting a lot of your arguments there can give you a lot of like basis to really answer and create a methodology that answers a lot of the concerns that people will kind of be reading against this type of argument. I think that when I'm thinking about like what are some of the more like case specific arguments that people will read, most of the times I feel like it'll really just be a question of like a strong crackdown debate, and a question of just like whether or not liberalism and things like that can really repair itself, which I think is a really strong like thing to really have down and be able to answer efficiently and poignantly, because I just think that it'll really show up often no matter what alternatives and what literature base you really read on this resolution. It's just like state recognition is good to check things like crackdown, etc. And I feel like this is the place where you can make so many arguments about about why endorsement by the state, for instance, in the context of like people like Martin Luther King, have meant nothing when they moved to more to like militant stances or resistance stances, and that there's kind of a limit to recognition in the way it places kind of like informal ruling on the way in which you're able to like assert and represent yourself. And I feel like being able to make arguments about why that kind of like officiates and creates its own crackdown is a good way to kind of like offensively take out the top level kind of like uniqueness question for this type of argument. And then I feel like the second kind of way to address it is then going in and being able to cite the various types of ways that like it's not a question of whether or not you can like infinitely escape crackdown or make like crackdown impossible, but rather the ways in which you can kind of think about a differential relationship to like the continuation of resistance tactics that's about like how do we pass on future ways to continually escape and disinvest from the state, instead of thinking that the idea of like militant crackdown means that we have to like bend down to its will, which I feel like is a really good place to kind of like source a lot of your responses about like why resistance has been so poignant throughout history, regardless of whether or not the state is able to crack down, and why like revolutionary like spirits and resistance like as something that kind of like carries on through generation is like just important and happens regardless of whether or not the state becomes militarized. And then I think when you kind of transition this onto the questions of the framework T debate, I really think that like starting like and having a good argument against framework T always starts at being able to have a strong crux critique of just the way in which the resolution operates. And I think being able to make arguments about why the workers strike doesn't allow us to do things like understand the way in which like prisoners relate to the question of the strike, the way in which we kind of like are only able to label and create the idea of what the worker is based off of dispossessing those that are like outside of the labor force and not seen as properly human to even engage the worker, and then not make it a question of whether or not that means that we should like refuse the worker as an idea as all, but rather a question of whether or not that should be the starting point for how we think about like legal recognition and how we think about what our politics should produce. And I feel like that combined with a really strong critique of the way in which human rights frameworks kind of like facilitate and staticize that kind of thinking and ultimately produce its own source of violence is definitely a really good place to kind of like really pinch that argument in and make it a lot easier for you to be able to like apply it throughout the rest of the framework arguments and weigh it against some of the more procedural arguments, because then you have this kind of like whole argument about how the topic in the resolution itself basically participates in that kind of consumption by the way in which it tries to create this kind of leftist orientation of policy in order to make the idea of critical affirmatives that refuse the locus of the state as something that is like outside or unnecessary because of the way in which the topic is becoming more expansive in the way in which it allows resistance to be thought of in its relationship to policy, which I definitely think is a place for you to like have a really nuanced debate about why reform kind of operates as its own parasitic form in the first place. Hopefully this kind of lays out the foundation to a lot of the stuff that we'll be talking about in the next video and other videos to come. And yeah, thanks as always for watching.